Thank you, George. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my job after that excellent lunch to keep you all awake, so I'm not going to do any talking at all. I'm going to make you hold a card in the air for about 20 minutes. If you could pull out the two cards at the back of your pack. One of them is blue. It may not be quite as blue as it is in the handout, and the other is about the same red. And what I want to just do is get a feel, and as George says, we're going to film this, so you just need to please hold it high above your head with whichever answer you wish to give. The first question is really relating to what happened before the guidelines and how much glyphosate you used. If you used 3 or more applications of glyphosate, please hold up the blue card, otherwise hold up the red card. And if you could hold them there, please, while the camera pans. We'll then do a card count. Okay, the next question, please, is very straightforward. Could you produce cereals and oilseeds cost effectively if glyphosate was not available to you to use? Yes for the blue card, no for the red card. Okay, thank you very much. What I'm now going to do, luckily, is talk about how you can avoid losing it, I hope. So it's a good job most of those were red. What I want to start by doing is just a little bit of looking back at what we've learned from resistance in the past and how that has developed on individual weeds. If we look back at blackgrass, most of this on this slide should be familiar with you apart from the lessons. Apart from the fact we spent too much time looking at one particular species, that happening to be at Peldon, relatively few people made many changes at the time. If they were quite subtle. Similarly with Italian ryegrass, as a result of R&D, predominantly by HGCA in those days, I can say it because it was then, and now AHDB, the research has shown that for wild oats and also for poppy, the emerging results of that, provided we have available alternative modes of action, and importantly that they are used, those weeds we have alternative strategies for. And although not based on research, everything we understand about chickweed and mayweed, again, using those actives and having them available, we should be able to manage quite simply. Looking by the mode of action, however, it's a slightly different story. If you go back far enough to the 1980s when it was the triazine resistance, they are no longer available anyway, but alternatives were available. Then we had IPU through synthetic auxin, which was a very limited population or few populations near Bath. But as ACCAs and then ALS inhibitor resistance became more common, especially in the case of blackgrass, for the sulfonylurea, I've said that most people were probably in denial that it was going to be a problem, but eventually it's caught up with them, and now we realise something had to be different. So why am I going to talk about glyphosate then, when there's not a problem yet, there's none here, but it has developed elsewhere in the world? Why are we worried when there are no cases yet in the UK? You've just voted with your cars to show how important glyphosate is to UK agriculture. It's developed worldwide such that there are now over 50 million hectares affected by 34 different weed species in a number of countries as close to us as Italy, Portugal and France. And over 50% of farms in the US have reported resistance problems, and something of the order of a 200% increase in costs having to manage it. I believe all of that was predictable. It was bound to happen. I think the only people that didn't think it would happen were some of the people selling the products. We now see increasing multiple resistance, as you've just seen, to the ALS and ACCA's inhibitors, and we know worldwide that that increases the risk of other things developing resistance. There are fewer alternatives, if nothing else. And we had reports of considerable use of glyphosate and over-reliance on it, and we were considering how could we reduce many of the herbicides we use in oilseed rape, for example, by using glyphosate between the rows and therefore reducing the risks of other herbicides appearing in water. All of which caused us serious issues, such that in June at Cereals, with AHDB support, we published the guidelines through WRAG, Weed Resistance Action Group, either a full 8-page version, but the first 2 pages are identical in their content, although the layout is different, and they are available from AHDB, and they are available in the foyer here. The 2 main threats we were particularly concerned of in there were either annual arable crops, but there are some very important issues on perennial crops and amenity use, but recognising the audience today, I'm going to focus on the annual arable crops. If you look at the risks over a number of different factors, it is very clear that the highest risk comes from continuous cropping of autumn crops or the same cropping pattern, where there is insufficient use of cultivation to kill weeds. I should stress that is both before glyphosate use, but also any cultivation that might happen after glyphosate use, which could also help kill any survivors of glyphosate application. We know it's worse where there's highest weed pressures, where you're relying on glyphosate only, and we've looked at the data and we believe that if you're using more than 2 applications and no cultivation, there is a much higher risk of resistance developing. And the other key thing is about the dose rate. And I'm going to say a few things about most of those very quickly, but you've got slides which will give you more detail if you wish to. So the 2 weeds we're worried about are blackgrass more generally and ryegrass, Italian ryegrass, where you have the problem. And it's all about making sure that we keep that option available between harvest of one crop and drilling of the next. The risk, if you are thinking about using it between rows post-emergence, is, we believe, higher, mainly because there are very few things you could do that actually help mitigate that increased risk. It is as near as you will get to the United States situation in the UK, where post-emergence use was used alone. One of the things you'll be familiar with glyphosate is if you add any additional active chemistry to it, it nearly always reduces the efficacy of glyphosate. Most mixtures are antagonistic. You need to be very careful when using non-label adjuvants, ones that aren't recommended, as we are very clear that the rate of use and the dose rate is very key in success. If that dose rate is reduced by use of an adjuvant, which is not giving you the same level of control, we believe the risk will be higher. We don't believe there's any increased risk from your pre-harvest use, and we encourage you to monitor success. So the dose and how to maximise it is absolutely key, and essentially it's the right dose at the right growth stage at the right conditions. And there's a bit more on that slide which helps you tell that, and there's even more in the full guidelines, including reminders about the use of nozzles and water volumes and water conditioners where necessary. But we also recognise that labels could be better. Unfortunately, the product has been so valuable to you for so long that most labels are a whole collection of different recommendations over time, each of which has come as a new recommendation added to it. As you see glyphosate products re-registered over the next 2 or 3 years, then we are encouraging the manufacturers to think how they do that, and there's some information on there we believe would be much more helpful, linking things like key dose rates to key weeds and how you can get higher levels of control. We also identified some knowledge gaps, particularly how important the risk of repeat application was in stubbles. Either do you actually need to apply that many, or how important are those risks if you've got additional mitigation options such as cultivation and obviously subsequent pre or post-emergence herbicides that are also active on the weeds. I've explained that the risk of glyphosate post-em, such as between crop rows, is an additional unknown quantity. And the other very difficult thing with glyphosate is you'll be very aware it takes typically, say, 2 to 3 weeks to know whether or not a plant is going to die. Well, the worst thing you can do is spray a survivor. So if we could tell you more quickly whether that plant is resistant and will survive or is going to die anyway, it would be helpful, and we know one or two things to do that. I'm very pleased to say that AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds have agreed to fund a project which is jointly with several of the manufacturers and also 4 of the distributors. The key thing here is that a lot of those sites will be using work from distributor sites to help feed into the project and also as a communication channel afterwards. And the aim will be here to fill in those gaps I've identified effectively and also to therefore improve the guidelines in future and the accuracy of them and whether or not you could do, say, 3 rather than 2, under what circumstances, and therefore also, as I've indicated, whether or not we can get an improved resistance test, particularly one more quickly. And I'll leave this in the handout. That is actually the specific objectives of the work, which you can study at your leisure. So the key thing then is, what do you do if you're applying glyphosate to stubbles? You need to avoid repeat applications and maximise the efficacy. But based on our current understanding, 2 applications, provided there's sufficient cultivation and effective subsequent herbicide use, should be a manageable risk. And you should avoid multiple applications, especially if there isn't any cultivation. For those of you who are considering using it between row crops, then it's a very similar situation. Again, 2 applications in total, so 1 might be to the stubble and 1 between the rows. And the key challenge here is you're usually trying to avoid using a herbicide within the crop. So your mitigation is likely to be less in this particular situation. So in summary, the resistance risk of glyphosate in the UK is such that it's highly important chemistry, and we believe although there is a real risk, it is a manageable risk provided we think about it now. That's what the WRAG guidelines have aimed to do, is to provide information to people which helps quantify that risk for their situations and also to provide information and guidance on how to avoid it. We know we need improved label information, and hopefully over time that will come through, and AHDB project will help fill some of the data gaps. I'm encouraging you to think now and do something, and we've tried to simplify this to 4 simple steps, which are, first of all, prevent survivors. It is the repeat application to any surviving plants which presents the highest risk. Maximise efficacy, use the right dose at the right timing in the right conditions, and a warning that unanimously everybody in WRAG agreed that reduced rates increase the risk through basically reduced efficacy. Use alternatives, whether they're cultivation or other non-chemical approaches when you can, but also use other herbicides, pre or post-em in particular, and beware mixtures usually reduce the effectiveness. And finally, monitor success, working with all of you as agronomists, removing any survivors if there's just a few, and preventing spread however you do it, and getting seed samples tested. So back to the theme of my talk, glyphosate resistance risk. WRAG jumped, we produced guidelines, we're trying to make people aware, and we've identified the knowledge gaps. AHDB jumped as well and have agreed to fund the project to help fill those data gaps, resulting in improved guidelines. So what will you do? Are you going to jump or wait until you're pushed, as has typically been the case in the past? Which leads me to the final question. So find your cards again. Based on everything you already knew, not just what I've said now, do you think you will change your strategy and be more careful how you use glyphosate such that you maintain the efficacy? Hold up the blue card if you're going to change. If you're going to carry on as you are, hold up the red card. Well, I'm pleased to say, and please hold them high so that we can pan the camera. It looks as though you're all worried about it. Hopefully your investment, AHDB, is justified by the blue cards. And I look forward to producing more information in the future and feeding back from those important projects. Thank you.